His admirers have called him the greatest spy who ever lived. His detractors regard him as nothing more than a raconteur and a con artist. Sidney Reilly, the enigmatic figure known as the Ace of Spies, was a man of many faces and even more secrets. Driven by opportunism and self-advancement, he was a master of disguise, a gifted linguist, and a maverick businessman who understood the power of information and influence in a world on the brink of war. From the oil fields of Iran to the corridors of power in London, St. Petersburg and New York, some of Reilly's exploits seem beyond the realms of possibility, and in many cases they probably were. His life is a patchwork of half-truths, embellishments, and carefully crafted fabrications. Was he a patriot serving the British Empire, or a mercenary driven by personal gain, a brilliant spy, or a skilled charlatan? Who really was the so-called Ace of Spies? The answer, like the man himself, remains shrouded in mystery, leaving us to wonder where the truth ends and the legend begins. It is generally accepted that Sidney Reilly was born Sigmund Rosenblum in Odessa in Ukraine in 1874. He was the product of an illicit union between a Russian woman of Polish origin and her Jewish physician from Vienna. This affair his mother managed to conceal, with the young boy being raised by his mother and legal father, a colonel in the Russian army. A bustling port city on the Black Sea, Odessa was a cosmopolitan city with both a large Jewish population and a nasty undercurrent of anti-Semitism. Not much of his early life is known beyond this, and his story picks up when he attended Vienna University to study chemistry. As a student, he reportedly joined a socialist political group called the Friends of Enlightenment and soon found himself in trouble with the Okhrana, the Imperial Russian secret police. What exactly he got up to is not known. However, his activities were sufficient to see him locked up in jail for a period by the Tsarist regime. His family connections allowed for his release from jail, but by that stage his mother had passed away, and an uncle revealed to Sigmund and the family the young man's true heritage. The triad of learning of his illegitimacy, his Jewish heritage, and trouble with the law marked a turning point in the young man's life, driving him to make a drastic decision about his future. Sigmund Rosenblum planned to flee the pogroms of his native Russia and to completely reinvent himself. After faking his own death in Odessa harbor, he adopted the alias Pedro and stowed away on a boat headed to South America. Arriving in Brazil, he spent the next 3 years working odd jobs, including being recruited to work as a cook by 3 British Army officers leading an expedition to explore the Amazon jungle. While stationed at the British mission, Rosenblum would later recount how, during an attack by a group of local tribesmen, he saved the lives of at least 2 British men in the expeditionary party. One of these men was Major Fothergill, who just so happened to be working for the British Secret Service. This act of heroism, or was it perhaps a later shrewd fabrication, secured Rosenblum a decent sum of cash, a ticket by ship to England, but most importantly, a British passport. This story, however, is just one version of events. A different account places Rosenblum in Paris rather than Brazil, just prior to the turn of the 20th century. In Paris, he was apparently working for the Okhrana, spying on Russian radicals. As the story goes, he fled to England after he and his case officer killed 2 anarchists traveling on a train. Rosenblum and his handler made off with a sizable sum of money that their victims had been transporting, and which was sufficient to fund their escape to England. Whatever the true facts, what is certain is that Rosenblum, adopting the name Sidney for the first time, arrived in London in 1895. It was not unusual for Russian Jewish immigrants to adopt a new identity when arriving in Great Britain. The need for a new start was not reserved only for those on the run from the law. These immigrants had in many cases escaped persecution and thought that a new name and ancestry would better help them achieve social and economic integration, personal safety, and access to better opportunities. By the next year, Sidney Rosenbloom had established himself as a consulting chemist, initially trading under the name Rosenbloom and Company, which he soon changed to the Ozone Preparation Company. Although he had never completed his studies in chemistry, he made his living selling patent medicines, or so-called miracle cures, to desperate and unsuspecting members of the public. Yet business was not going as well as he hoped, but when he took on a new patient, a wealthy but ailing London reverend named Hugh Thomas, he saw the possibility of his fortunes taking a turn for the better. Reverend Thomas, a man in his 60s, was married to a much younger woman named Margaret Callahan Thomas. While treating the good reverend, Rosenbloom became a good friend of the Thomas family, and as it soon became clear, he was more than a friend to Margaret. While Reverend Thomas was in the care of Sidney Rosenbloom, he died suddenly and unexpectedly from heart failure. Just a week prior to his death, he had appointed his wife Margaret as his executrix and left his entire estate to her in his will. No autopsy was conducted, and Reverend Thomas was buried within 3 days. Barely before the Reverend's casket had been lowered, Sidney and Margaret were married. Sidney Rosenbloom, in one fell swoop, had acquired for himself a wife, a sizable fortune, and something else he desired even more, a legal basis to anglicize his Jewish surname. The marriage was registered using the surname Reilly, and thus, for the first time, the Russian Jew from Odessa adopted the persona of an Irishman named Sidney George Reilly. The change of name was possibly also prompted by his employer, Scotland Yard. This marked a pivotal moment in his life, solidifying his commitment to shedding his past and embracing a new identity that would allow him to navigate the world of espionage and intrigue. Since his arrival in England 3 years earlier, Sidney Reilly had also been working as an informer for Scotland Yard's Special Branch. Headed by William Melville, Special Branch was created in 1887 and was responsible for combating subversion, including monitoring the activities of Russian and Polish émigré communities. Melville saw the value in cultivating a network of informers within these communities. However, language and cultural barriers made it challenging for officers to infiltrate these groups directly. Reilly, with his growing network of contacts and his fluency in both Russian and English, became a valuable asset to Melville. The money Reilly received from Special Branch for information he gathered on known Russian radicals, he used to finance his lifestyle of high living. His business dealings and his assignments for Scotland Yard took him across Europe, from Spain and Italy to the Caucasus. Even so, at the turn of the 20th century, Sidney Reilly was strapped for cash. When he learned through his Scotland Yard network that the Russians were investigating a ruble counterfeiting ring operating in London, he decided that it was best for him and his wife to relocate. Their choice? Port Arthur in Manchuria. And so, in 1901, Sidney and Margaret left England, bound for the East. At the time, Port Arthur was a strategically significant Russian naval base and a focal point of tensions between Russia and Japan. Both empires had competing imperial ambitions in Manchuria and Korea. Upon his arrival in Port Arthur, Reilly took on the guise of a timber salesman, seizing the opportunity to engage in various commercial enterprises that thrived in the wake of the impending regional conflict. He quickly became affiliated with Moisey Ginsburg, a prominent businessman whose company was the principal supplier to the Russian Pacific Fleet. Reilly's fluency in multiple languages and his sharp business acumen positioned him as a vital asset in these ventures, becoming in his own right a major importer of American timber. His entrepreneurial spirit was, however, not the only thing that Reilly put to work while in the naval fortress. It is believed that he continued to operate his network of naval officials and businessmen to collect and share information for both British and Japanese intelligence. Some accounts suggest that he provided critical insights into the growing power of the Russian Navy, possibly assisting Japanese forces in their military strategy against Russia. When the Russo-Japanese War began on the 8th of February 1904 with a surprise attack by the Japanese against the Russians in Port Arthur, Reilly decided it was again time to make a dash for it. This time, he left behind his wife Margaret, from whom he had become estranged. Later in 1904, Sidney Reilly re-emerged in Paris. The timing was, as always, opportune. As the importance of oil as a fuel, in particular for the navies of empires, became increasingly apparent, Reilly became embroiled in a high-stakes negotiation that would shape the future of British energy interests. 3 years earlier, in 1901, British businessman William Knox D'Arcy secured a 60-year concession from the Persian government, which is present-day Iran, to explore for oil. However, Mr. D'Arcy soon found himself struggling to raise the necessary capital to develop the promising oil fields. The British Admiralty recognized the strategic importance of securing a reliable oil supply for the Royal Navy and was deeply concerned over the possibility of the oil rights falling into foreign hands. The Admiralty was thus intent on persuading Mr. D'Arcy to sell the oil rights to a British syndicate. The problem was, the British knew that they were competing against the interests of the Rothschild family, who were soon to meet with Mr. D'Arcy and were likely to make him an offer he couldn't refuse. William Melville, Reilly's SIS spy master, tasked him with uncovering the details of the Rothschilds' offer to Mr. D'Arcy and finding a way to persuade the businessman to sell to the British government instead. The negotiation with Mr. D'Arcy was to take place on the French Riviera aboard the Rothschilds' yacht. Reilly soon devised a cunning plan to infiltrate that meeting. The tale goes that Sidney Reilly disguised himself as a priest fundraising for a local orphanage and rowed a boat out to the yacht. Telling those aboard that he was seeking alms for the poor, he was allowed on board. He then allegedly managed to approach Mr. D'Arcy discreetly, passing him a pamphlet with a hidden message indicating that he was acting on behalf of His Majesty's government. The note said that the British government would be prepared to double whatever offer the Rothschilds were making. Mr. D'Arcy didn't give away that the priest on board the yacht was in fact a fraud, and agreed to a later meeting with Reilly. Ultimately, Reilly's ingenuity and the persistence of the British Admiralty paid off. In 1905, an agreement was signed between Mr. D'Arcy and the Burma Oil Company, effectively keeping the oil rights under British control. This deal paved the way for the formation of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would later evolve into the energy giant known today as British Petroleum or BP. Following the D'Arcy affair, Sidney Reilly for the first time decided to return to Russia, settling in St. Petersburg. There he engaged in various business ventures, capitalizing on Russia's rapid industrialization and naval rearmament program. Amidst all the wheeling and dealing, Reilly met a woman named Nadine Massino. She was the beautiful wife of the aide-de-camp to a senior Russian minister responsible for awarding shipbuilding contracts. Sidney and Nadine soon started an affair, with Nadine divorcing her husband to allow them to marry. Reilly, however, had no such intentions, his relationship with Nadine having been chiefly motivated to position himself as near as he could to his mistress's husband. Compounding this romantic conundrum was the arrival of his estranged wife Margaret, who pitched up unexpectedly in St. Petersburg. Shockingly, she was seeking financial support from her husband. Reilly decided that this was all too much to bear, and that it was nigh on time to make yet another international move. As Europe descended into the chaos of World War I in 1914, Sidney Reilly decided that his interests would be best served in New York City. There he operated as a war contractor, brokering deals for wartime munitions contracts for Russia. He amassed a considerable fortune during this time, and thus he was not so much concerned about the war in Europe, but more so about his personal relationships. His mistress from Petrograd, Nadine Massino, was not a woman to be scorned. In 1915, she followed her beau to New York. Traveling under the name Nadine Zaleski, she sent Reilly a telegram alerting him to her arrival. She also sent a cable to the New York police to inform them that Reilly was importing a woman into the state for immoral purposes. This was a crime under the Mann Act, a federal law that prohibited the transportation of women across state lines for immoral purposes as they defined them. When Nadine arrived in New York City on the 15th of February 1915, the police promptly arrested Reilly. To avoid prosecution, he was forced to marry Nadine. The ceremony took place the next day in Manhattan. Of course, Reilly was still married to his first wife Margaret, so found himself in a bit of a pickle given the illegality of bigamous marriages. Reilly lied about both his age and his marital status, claiming to be a bachelor. He said that he was the son of George and Pauline Reilly of Clonmel in Ireland. The marriage was duly registered, making Reilly a bigamist. Things were equally difficult for Reilly's business ventures around this time. The abdication of Nicholas II on the 15th of March 1917 marked not only the end of the Russian Empire and its ruling Romanov dynasty, but it also saw Reilly's role as an arms dealer for Russia suddenly come to an end. When the Russian monarchy fell, the British government took over his contracts. The strife in both his personal life and business affairs gave pause for Reilly to consider yet another move. In October of 1917, he travelled to Canada where he enlisted in the Royal Flying Corps. He underwent his pilot training in Toronto, after which he was posted to England where he arrived on New Year's Day 1918. He said his decision was motivated by a sense of idealism and service to his adopted nation. However, it seems more likely that he saw it as a means to advance his career in intelligence. During the time that Reilly spent in the USA, Sir Mansfield Cumming, the head of MI6 and Original C, had instructed his agents in the United States, Colonel Norman Thwaites and Sir William Wiseman, to keep tabs on and in touch with him. Reilly's arrival in England as a commissioned officer of the Royal Flying Corps was an excellent opportunity for MI6 to speak with Reilly. On the 13th of January 1918, Reilly met with MI6 and formally applied for intelligence work. While he put together his application, MI5 conducted a background check, which included surveillance of his lodgings on Ryder Street. After observing his activities in and around London, MI5 found him to be very respectable. MI6, however, did have some concerns about his past activities and reliability. These included allegations of Reilly having spied for Japan during his time in Port Arthur, and his alleged involvement in corrupt arms dealing and currency counterfeiting. Despite all this, Sir Mansfield Cumming decided to proceed with Reilly's recruitment. He saw in Sidney Reilly a man who was able to work any angle, being able to acquire information and cultivate influential contacts where others couldn't. This made him an appealing, albeit controversial, candidate for MI6. What exactly Reilly got up to in his early days of working for MI6 is not clear. Some say that he was flown into Germany and infiltrated the German general staff. Others say that he snuck through German lines to steal invaluable intelligence on the German naval fleet. Whatever it was that he got up to, it was towards the end of the Great War, as regional troubles flared up in Reilly's homeland, that he was given his most difficult assignment yet. In 1917, Russia found itself in the throes of revolution. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in November 1917. The shockwave of political upheaval was felt far beyond Russia's borders. British officials were desperate to keep Russia in the war, forcing Germany to fight on two fronts. The Allies' worst fears were realized when Russia and the Central Powers signed the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty on the 3rd of March 1918. The Allies saw it as crucial to their war plans that Russia get back in the fight. Thus, with the goal of rallying anti-Bolsheviks to overthrow the Red Revolutionaries and install a pro-Allied government, British intelligence decided to turn to their ace in the hole. Although Reilly was chiefly motivated by his own selfish interests and desire to get ahead, if there was one thing he hated, it was Bolshevism. He viewed the ideology as a dangerous threat to the civilized world and believed it had to be crushed in its infancy before spreading like a cancer. He had a personal interest in the national identity of Russia, and so was quick to accept his new mission. In May of 1918, Sidney Reilly was dispatched by Cummings to Moscow. He arrived in the city as the revolution was nearing its bloody climax with a seemingly impossible task. At whatever cost, get Russia back in the war. Reilly wasn't working alone. He teamed up with, among others, fellow British intelligence operative George Alexander Hill, Robert Bruce Lockhart, who was the British representative to the Soviet government, and Ernest Boyce, the head of the SIS station in Moscow. The counter-revolution being planned by Reilly and his co-conspirators quickly started to gain traction. Reilly, it is contended, managed to infiltrate the security apparatus surrounding key Bolshevik figures. Soon enough, a network grew of disaffected men and women who were sick of communism and its never-ending violence and food shortages. As usual, Reilly had a mistress in every city. In Moscow, he lived with Elizaveta Otten. In Petrograd, he paid 20,000 rubles to his girlfriend Olga Starzakaya to buy and furnish an apartment. There were many ways in which he could have approached his mission, but Reilly, never being one to think small, concocted a plan that went a little beyond his official brief. His goal was to convince the Latvian regiments in Russia to turn against the Bolsheviks and to aid him in capturing Lenin and his top lieutenant, Leon Trotsky. The Lets, although having significant cultural and religious differences, had become steadfastly loyal to Russia after they were displaced from their Latvian homeland by the Germans. By June of 1918, their military men had become indispensable to the Soviet regime. The Let regiments were entrusted with guarding key positions from the Kremlin to Russian gold reserves and munitions depots. They also formed the backbone of the Red Army and, more importantly, the personal guard of Vladimir Lenin and his generals. If enough of their number could be turned, Reilly had a chance of pulling off his greatest secret operation yet. Assuming the fictitious identity of Comrade Relinsky, committed officer of the Cheka, Reilly managed to infiltrate the security apparatus surrounding key Bolshevik figures and started to grow a network of men and women who were already sick of communism and its never-ending violence and food shortages. His plan looked like it was coming together as he made connections and spread dissent. Reilly's grand plan was due to take place on the 28th of August 1918 at the Moscow Grand Theatre. This is where Lenin and Trotsky were due to address the Grand Committee of the Soviet Union. When a signal was given, the intention was for the Latvian Guard stationed in the theatre to lock the doors and turn their rifles on the audience. Trotsky and Lenin were then to be arrested in front of their most ardent supporters and acolytes. Reilly had no initial designs to execute the Bolshevik leaders, for this would have risked their being turned to martyrs for the Soviet cause. Reilly had something rather more nuanced in mind. He planned to parade Lenin and Trotsky around the streets of Moscow in their underwear. This was designed as a spectacle to destroy their power through ridicule rather than martyrdom. Sidney Reilly no doubt knew that if successful, his plan stood to change the course of history. He and his co-conspirators were, however, oblivious to the fact that their counter-revolutionary group had already been infiltrated by the Cheka, the fearsome first Soviet secret police and intelligence agency. 2 agents of the Cheka, posing as disaffected Latvians, had been accepted by Reilly into their ranks. When a 3rd double agent was introduced, Reilly and his team were blissfully unaware that their every movement was being monitored and every discussion reported back to the Cheka. The enemy agents didn't like that Reilly and his group were not planning violence. They planted seeds of an assassination. If the idea were to germinate, the propaganda victory when the plot was exposed would be all the more valuable. The compromise of the operation by the Cheka was not the only thing working against them. The meeting of the Soviet Central Executive Committee at which their plan was to be carried out was postponed shortly before it was due to happen. Then, 2 days later, on the 30th of August 1918, a lone gunner and member of the Social Revolutionary Party attempted an assassination against Lenin. Vanya Kaplan shot at Lenin 3 times at point-blank range as he left a meeting at the Michelson factory in Moscow. 1 bullet narrowly missed his heart, another passed just millimeters away from his jugular, the 3rd passed harmlessly through his coat. A seriously injured Lenin only barely survived the attack and would be plagued by health problems for the rest of his life. This proved a historical turning point. While Kaplan had acted independently and was unconnected to Reilly's plot, the Cheka used the incident, along with the assassination of their senior leader Moisey Uritsky, on the same day to justify a total crackdown on political opponents. This provided them with the pretext to reinstate capital punishment and to launch the Red Terror. The net was immediately closed on all those involved in what was dubbed the Lockhart Plot. Reilly's carefully crafted plan had completely unraveled. His network had disintegrated, and many of its members were arrested and executed. Reilly, however, along with George Alexander Hill, managed to initially give their pursuers the slip. Reilly arrived at the British Embassy in Petrograd seeking refuge, only to discover that it had just been stormed by the Bolshevik forces. The embassy door had been battered down, the Union Jack had been torn away, and Captain Francis Cromie, a British naval attaché, lay dead on the floor, the result of trying to defend the embassy from the Bolsheviks. Then a fugitive with a price on his head, Reilly was forced into hiding. After lying low for a period, Reilly eventually managed to bribe his way onto a Dutch freighter, escaping Russia and leaving behind the turmoil and violence of the Bolshevik Revolution. Allied Bolshevik relations were left in tatters in the wake of the Lockhart Plot, and Russia, of course, never re-entered the war. Their paranoia seemingly justified, the Bolsheviks wove a narrative of foreign treachery and imperialist meddling, which captivated the Russian public. The Red Terror continued for the next 4 years, with Lenin and his comrades having an unquenchable thirst for political and social bloodletting. Sidney Reilly had managed a narrow escape, but this did not stop the Soviet government from trying him in absentia and sentencing him to death. For the international community, and Great Britain in particular, the plot became a political hot potato. Nations sympathetic to the Bolshevik cause pointed accusatory fingers at the Allied powers, decrying what they saw as blatant interference in Russia's internal affairs. They were left in a precarious position. British covert attempts to influence events in Russia lay in ruins, exposed for all to see. As they grappled with the fallout, their policies towards the fledgling Soviet state became a confused tangle of conflicting interests and half-measures. After his dramatic escape from Russia, a weary Reilly returned to London in November 1918. He was awarded the Military Cross for his services to the Crown. As the guns in the Great War fell silent, his activities continued to center around his fervent anti-communist beliefs and remained obsessed with overthrowing the Bolshevik regime. It was his pursuit to overthrow the ideology that would eventually lead to his downfall. He wasn't in England for long before being sent back to Russia on yet another assignment. This time, in late 1918, he was sent along with George Alexander Hill to observe the situation on the Black Sea coast and to gather information for the upcoming peace conference in Paris. Travelling undercover under the auspices of the British Trade Corporation, he departed for Russia once again on the 12th of December 1918. For the next 2 years, Reilly's personal commitment to the White Russian cause in the Civil War became even more pronounced. He was eventually recalled from this role, moving around Europe on various assignments. By 1920, Reilly was once again living in New York, where he was pursuing a banking scheme. His second bigamous marriage to Nadine Massino had by then broken down. Reilly's numerous affairs no doubt had something to do with it. Although their marriage was never legal in the first place, they went through the motions of a divorce in 1922. Later that year, Reilly met who was to become his third and final wife. Pepita Bobadilla was the wealthy widow of playwright Charles Haddon Chambers. Meeting in Berlin in December 1922, they were married in London in May of the next year. Despite not having any military rank, Reilly styled himself as Captain Reilly, using the title to boost his business dealings and social status. It seemed perhaps that Reilly's days of intrigue and subterfuge were over, but then, in 1925, he received a fateful letter that would, for the last time, send him hurtling headfirst into the covert world of international espionage. The letter was written by Ernest Boyce, the former British SIS chief in Moscow, who was then the station chief in Helsingfors, now Helsinki. The letter, written in code, informed Reilly of an underground group calling themselves the Trust. The organization claimed to be an anti-Bolshevik resistance group operating within Soviet Russia seeking help in establishing their plans to oust the communist regime. Reilly still harbored hopes of a counter-revolution and saw this as an opportunity to advance his anti-communist agenda. Reilly was skeptical, yet intrigued. With a death sentence hanging over his head in Russia, travelling to Finland was not without its risks. But on the assurances given to him by Boyce as to the legitimacy of the trust, Reilly agreed to travel to Viborg in Finland to meet with high-ranking representatives of the trust. Once there, he was fed enough information to keep him interested, but was encouraged by the 2 trust operatives he met to cross the border into Russia to meet with other senior members of the group. Against his better judgment, Reilly agreed and crossed into Russia. As you may have already surmised, the trust was a Soviet counterintelligence operation devised by the Cheka to lure Reilly back to Russia. As soon as he was across the border, Sidney Reilly was arrested and taken to that most dreaded of locations, the Lubyanka prison in Moscow. For months he was interrogated and tortured, and ultimately the Grand Master Spy Sidney Reilly was executed on the 5th of November 1925 by the OGPU. He received the sentence that was customary for Soviet traitors, being a piece of lead in the back of the head. This marked the tragic end to Sidney Reilly's turbulent life, one which was characterized by adventure, intrigue, and ultimately deception. The Soviet Union never publicly acknowledged his execution, which left room for speculation as to his fate and whether his disappearance was just a deliberate final act by a man again seeking to start afresh. It was only after the USSR was dismantled that official reports of Reilly's execution surfaced. Looking back at the life of the man dubbed the Ace of Spies, Sidney Reilly's ability to cultivate an aura of secrecy and self-promotion has left behind a trail of contradictory accounts and unverifiable claims. Reilly's tendency to embellish his exploits, combined with the clandestine nature of his work, contributed significantly to the growth of the master spy myth that has endured for the last century. This myth was further fueled by the book written by his third wife, Pepita, which, although intended to keep the search for Reilly alive after his disappearance in 1925, presented a romanticized version of his life. Despite the uncertainties surrounding many aspects of Reilly's life, his involvement in key global events, including World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the Russian Civil War, solidified his legendary status. His personal life, marked by multiple marriages, numerous mistresses, and a penchant for high-stakes gambling, further colored the aura of his mystique. Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, acknowledged that Reilly's exploits served as an inspiration for the iconic fictional spy. Fleming's now famous statement that James Bond is just a piece of nonsense I dreamed up, he's not a Sidney Reilly, you know, underscores the larger-than-life persona that Reilly portrayed. Accounts from MI6 officials who worked with Reilly reveal a complex and often contradictory individual. While acknowledging his courage and intelligence, they also highlighted his unscrupulous tendencies and willingness to exploit others for personal gain. He was no doubt ruthless and opportunistic, making him a figure of both admiration and skepticism. However you view Mr. Reilly, we today can enjoy the tales associated with his life because he never let the truth get in the way of a good story. He was a man of many names and was always on the run. But perhaps all along, Sidney Reilly was just fleeing from his own shadow.